No one has a monopoly on the truth. Our version of our own truths are based on our own lived experiences. In this space, we welcome different perspectives to learn, unlearn, and enlighten. Welcome to The Lantern. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Lantern podcast. This episode is going to be a little different as I am going to be doing a solo cast. On this solo cast, I'm hoping to shed some light on some of the systems that we find ourselves in and how sometimes maybe having a deeper understanding of those systems can help elevate those feelings of mental and emotional distress that we may feel in those environments, and also how with understanding we're able to alleviate some of these feelings of mental and emotional distress. So I am going to be speaking about this in the context of the legal industry because surprisingly, I did actually have a conversation with somebody who, is in law school and is looking at the industry from the outside in. And I think that their perspective is just things do not look good. I think that they're of the view that it's not necessarily a sustainable career. And I mean, I don't want to draw any conclusions for anybody, but I think, as I say, in helping individuals understand where some of this stress and anxiety may be coming from, perhaps explaining a bit about that, the journey at that infancy stage will help those at that stage better navigate their circumstances and also better support themselves in those circumstances. So I think as a starting point, we need to realize that mental health and wellness cannot necessarily be divorced from certain structures. These are things are actually interwoven into certain structures because it's the byproduct of our presence, existence, participation in those structures that ends up impacting the quality, let me say, of our mental and emotional well-being. So, as I said, for purposes of explaining how the two are correlated, I will be using law school as an example, but I believe that, anybody, no matter what industry you're in, you'll be able to listen to the podcast and hopefully follow through my thought process, right? So we need to get to a point of interrogating the system and critically analyzing what exactly happens when you go into law school, right? So when it comes to stress and anxiety, one thing that we have to realize is that these feelings don't just arise by virtue of you going into a law firm or working as in-house counsel. These feelings already start from law school. And the reason why, in law school is most of these law schools take a large volume of students into their programs. And from then already, it's quite a competitive process because from, let's say, 400 students, the schooling system is already streamlining itself that, I think only 150 or 200 people will actually graduate with a degree. And then from those 200 people, you'll find that maybe 90 to 100 would then make their way into a top 5 law firm, big law. And that sort of feeds into the system and the environment and the way in which people feel when they find themselves in those environments. It is unfortunate that it is set up in that way because if you think about it, it already ignites a scarcity mindset, right? Because as I've already sort of pinpointed in terms of the numbers game, if there's 400 of you at the beginning, but only 200 can make it, and then from the 200, only 100 will get into the top five law firms, you can already see that It's nothing personal. It's just kind of set up in that way. But it does breed a mentality of scarcity. And we all know that as humans, whenever we're in an environment where there's scarcity, a lack of resource, a lack of opportunity, within ourselves, that creates feelings of stress, anxiety, of course, because naturally you want to be the one who does make it through that grueling process and is the one that, gets selected to join these top firms. Also, it does breed within the environment a high level of competition, right? Because now other people are also looking at other people's journeys, other people's academic performance. And, at law school, that's ultimately what you're being measured on, is your academic performance. So that's where the competition really starts. And then the next, level of competition would be around who's getting their articles or their offers of traineeship at these big firms, right? So, I mean, I don't want to say that necessarily law school is toxic. As I say, I think that the purpose of this is just to give people a broader sort of understanding, because in having a more bird's eye view or general view as to what's going on in a bigger scale, you can help yourself elevate any feelings of stress, anxiety, or depression that you may be feeling. It's very normal and natural to want the best for yourself in those circumstances. I mean, a lot of people who go through who access higher education, they have ambitions for themselves. They obviously want to be the best at what they're doing. They want to get the highest marks. But that's obviously driven by the fact that these institutions, your big fives, and, mid-tier firms as well, value candidates who obviously are getting good marks, because that obviously speaks to the academic intellect, and that helps sort of giving them an indication of how you will be able to adapt intellectually once you enter the legal working sphere. But as I say, there's nothing wrong with wanting the best for yourself. However, it shouldn't come at your own detriment, and especially when it comes to your health, and I understand when a lot of students will come and speak to me, they already are feeling burnt out, stressed, depressed, anxiety at law school. So I guess when they speak to people who are within the legal industry at other levels ahead of them, they're kind of putting two and two together and realizing the math really isn't mathing, because if I'm already feeling these feelings at this level, it's only going to get worse as I ascend the ranks. In previous podcasts, I have said that, with a lot of these institutions, this type of education, when it comes to mindfulness, well-being, mental health, is not necessarily integrated into those systems. So the onus would be on you as a student, law student, to find ways and coping mechanisms to deal with the system, I will say, that you find yourself in, right? But as I say, listening to something like this and understanding the bigger picture and how the funneling actually works can help elevate those feelings of anxiety, stress, and depression. I just do want to note at this point that I know there are some older people who are quite critical of the younger people who do experience these feelings of stress and anxiety and depression early on in their lives. However, I think that, stress is relative. Anxiety and depression, they're relative to where you find yourself at a particular point in your life and what your goal or what the pinnacle of success is for you at that point, and what your mountain peak is for you at that point. And I think when you find yourself in law school, your goal and what you want to achieve is, not only is it graduating cum laude, dean's list, golden key, getting into a big five firm. Those are all the things that you aspire to achieve. And obviously, in tandem with that, you want to then secure a contract at one of these big firms, because, again, you've invested so much time. And, I think for me, time is something that I would have to discuss on a separate podcast because I don't want to detract from explaining the interconnectedness between mental health, wellness, and structures by now going into time, value, money. That's a whole another podcast for another time. But it's also one thing that you need to keep in mind is that you're never going to be this young again. So I understand that, you've invested 4 or 5 years of your life into just studying. And that's a long time. To be very honest with you, you could do a whole lot in 4 and 5 years other than sitting down, and consuming academic materials with the hopes of then securing an employment contract at these top firms. And nothing is really guaranteed. I do always say to students that I speak to, what it takes to get in and what it takes to stay in is very different. And that's why I still believe agility is the characteristic or the trait that you need to have, because things are always constantly evolving and things are always constantly changing. Once you get in, staying in is a different ballgame. So you can't necessarily apply the same mindset, the same mentality, and the same approach that you did when you were still trying to secure VAC work or articles. You need to always remember that your mind needs to remain malleable in these circumstances. All right, so now back to the funneling. So it's worth understanding that, there is a sort of funneling, narrowing down, squid game, whatever you want to call it, that already happens, when you start law school up until when the cohort that finishes law school, right? And that, we must understand, is a breeding ground for competition, anxiety, stress, depression. And some people do make it to the end in one piece. Some people don't. We understand that that is the nature of things. But I think that some people, obviously, within law school do lose that element of compassion. And that's where I think some of the pervasive toxicness that happens at the higher levels finds itself, right? Because in you already not showing compassion to maybe your friend in law school. And again, I don't want to get into whether you can necessarily form genuine connections in law school, because again, as I said, it's so competitive, right? If you come into a lecture venue and you're now telling your friends that you've secured a contract at these big 5 firms, they may not necessarily be your friends after that because they're thinking, well, what's wrong with me? You've managed to do this thing. So in my own experience, I found it was quite difficult to get that support within law school, just purely because it was very competitive and not as collaborative as I necessarily thought it would be. But again, that's me and that's my personality. So I did find myself having friends in other, what do we call them? In other faculties. That's the word I'm looking for, in other faculties, which to me worked to my advantage because I think it kept me distant from the competitive attitudes of people who I was with in law school. And it also kept me sane and grounded in a sense that I was always aware of what was going on outside of my faculty. So I never thought I'm special because I'm in law school and only like people in law school can be anxious and stressed and depressed. No, my friend in med school was just as stressed, just as anxious, just as depressed as I was. Also had the same ambitions, wanted to be the best, wanted to graduate top of her class, wanted to go and obviously practice in the best hospitals in the country. So that sort of, for me, kept me grounded by giving me that context that it's not just law school, it's every faculty. And I think it's good to, as I say, it's good to always have that objective perspective so that you don't end up taking things personally. And when you take things personally, that also contributes to these feelings of stress, anxiety, depression, and isolation, because you will be deluding yourself into thinking, oh, it's just me, I'm the only one going through this. That's not necessarily true. I do now actually want to segue and speak about the isolation point, because again, on my podcast with Lisa Mendoza, we spoke about the loneliness pandemic, and I think coming out of COVID, the younger generations or younger than myself struggle when it comes to making genuine connections. So to my mind, when I extrapolate that for me, I mean, I was in law school pre-COVID time. I already struggled to make genuine connections just because of, the nature of law school and it being in direct contradiction, or there was a clash between my personality and that system. Then I'm thinking about students who endured COVID and that social isolation and don't necessarily have the tools to then make those genuine connections. To my mind, I can see how that can actually be making law school a very lonely journey for some people. And I know that it will be surprising because you would think, how can it be a lonely journey when there's 400, 500 of you? But as I explained, it's the scaling down, it's the funneling, it's the pyramid that then, when it's too competitive, of course, then people will decide to go into their small pockets and isolate themselves and think that they're the only ones going through a certain situation. It becomes easy just to go inward and not speak about what you're going through. So the loneliness and the isolation also comes into play, because if you don't find like-minded people that will help you just talk it through. And as I said, for me, I was lucky that I did have friends in other faculties who I could say like, hey, this is what I'm going through. I'm really stressed about this. I need to get this mark. I need to maintain this. They would respond, and meet me with that level of compassion. Whereas I didn't necessarily find the same level of compassion in law school just due to its competitive nature. So once the funneling has happened and people then make their way into Big Five or firms, mid-tier, just underneath Big Five, just as good, but I mean, just smaller in terms of size. There's now another level of competition, right? Because of course, everyone has made it. They've been, Dean's List, your cum laudes, and now you're at the pinnacle of your success. At that point, you've reached your mountain. That's the hill you will die on. And now you go into a law firm. And when you go into the law firm, it's the same. You're kind of at the bottom of a new mountain now, because you're all starting as a cohort of trainees, candidates, attorneys, and the funneling again, it begins, because not everyone is going to make it to associate level. Not everyone is going to make it to senior associate level. Not everyone is going to make it to partnership level. So the pyramid then starts to exist all over again. So you can already see that for someone whose nervous system was already overly regulated for 5 solid years, just trying to be the best in law school, when you come into an environment where it's now demanding you to start all over again, a new mountain, this is why people who are in law firms are the way that they are, mentally and emotionally, if you're not aware. And that's why I firmly stand by awareness, mindfulness. These are important traits that you need to work on from law school, because I think if you're already mindful of the structure, as I've explained, and the next structure that you go into, you'll be able to better manage your feelings, your mental and emotional well-being when it comes to finding yourself in that next structure. But this is not something that is embedded at an academic level, and then you find yourself going into, structures where you're not necessarily going to have an ample amount of time to work on your mental and emotional well-being. But also it's unfortunate that environment has met you at a time or at a phase where you're at a heightened level of emotional and mental distress. And I mean, if we even think about, I think the time between when you leave law school to when you go to your first law firm, it's not that much time to recover. It's probably 2 to 3 months. And then, you're expected to go into the next structure and now make your way, starting all over again. But as I say, if you're not conscious that, I found myself in this structure, it created feelings of stress, anxiety, depression, loneliness within me by virtue of it being what it is, right? I've now gone to a law firm. It's going to be pretty much the same feelings that I'm going to be feeling, but now for different reasons, because now your structure and your system is different. right? So, I mean, I don't want to get into the law firm structures and ascending to partnership ranks too much, because I think, again, that's a separate podcast. Again, because that is just also something that it's its own beast. And the intention here is not to really scare anybody or deter anyone. I never do that. Whenever people come to me and they tell me, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that, I 100% back them, but I do open their eyes and make sure that they're well aware and also critically analyzing the system that they're going into. Because you can't not achieve anything until you're prepared for it, right? So my role is just to prepare people that, look, okay, you want to do this. This is everything that you need to know about it. These are the pros, these are the cons. And then you are the one that needs to then find a way to negotiate yourself in that system and find a way of how you're best going to thrive in that system. But I mean, I'm not going to say to anybody, don't do it. No. I think that it is a journey. It is a worthwhile journey, and it is one worth pursuing. So now I think I've focused on those that have actually made it, and I will still say made it because, again, I think with this journey, success is subjective. To some people, going to a big law firm is success, but for others, maybe going to a smaller firm is success. And these things actually, they balance out. And I've seen it with my own cohort, where some people who may not necessarily have been with us at these big firms made their way to those big firms within 5 years. So things actually do end up balancing out. But, the in between times and what happens to people who didn't make it is not something that's really spoken about, right? Because I think once you get to a certain point and then you establish your new circle and your new circumstance and a new perspective, you don't necessarily, I think, unless you're very observant and aware and compassionate, you don't necessarily think about, oh, what happened to all the people that didn't make it in this setting, right? So I think that's also why we need this level of compassion, because it doesn't only happen at one stage, it's happening at multiple stages of the journey. And the reason why I'm bringing this up now with regards to the compassion is I think that is what has also been missing in our collective journey to wellness, because we kind of have a very individualistic approach to our wellness. But, I did highlight this African proverb the other day, where it's like, I'm not well if you're not well. And if one of us is not well, we're all not well. And for me, I think that is something that we need to work towards, is collective wellness, right? But in moving towards collective wellness and a more compassionate future, it comes with us understanding these structures and not necessarily thinking less of those who don't make it in these structures. Because, again, as I said, much of what we determine to be success is subjective, right? So we cannot necessarily judge one person. We cannot necessarily judge everybody based on one person's version of success. I think that's what we're kind of seeing with the Gen Zers, that they've kind of realized that, okay, I understand that the journey looked a linear way before, but you know what, for me, this is not success. Success would look a different way for me. And I think we need to remain open to new ways of thinking, because that is the only way that things will change. I don't necessarily think that we had the healthiest system to begin with, because, as I say, thinking about the ramp up time of about 5 years of having your nervous system overloaded, to then making it into the career, and then, finding yourself at the bottom of the new mountain, and then your nervous system is only going to continue to be overstimulated. You can imagine the product the impact rather of that has on your nervous system and on your health if you're not conscious of taking care of yourself and even mindful of the structure and the system that you find yourself in and how it works. So In rounding out my solo cast, I would say that most importantly is for you to educate yourself about the structure that you're finding yourself in, right? If you're feeling these feelings of stress and anxiety and depression, interrogate the structure that you're in. What's driving the structure? What is the output? If you're at university and the cohort is 400 people, but you know that only 100 people graduate, it just goes without saying, not everybody can then make it. And as to how that is determined, of course, we know that that's judged on academic intellect, but that doesn't make you more intelligent than somebody else, because again, everybody came from a previous, high school where they were academically inclined. They were already intelligent. It may just mean you may not necessarily meet that certain criteria. So it's nothing personal. It's just the way that the system is, right? I think it is also imperative that you have a set of expectations, but you need to be amenable and agile as to how you're going to negotiate reaching those expectations. Because again, not everybody can make it. This is something that I always speak about with, again, the students that will reach out to me. And these are just South African students. I just want to qualify that, because it would be relevant for what I'm about to say. What's going on in South Africa is you're not unique to South Africa. There are Gen Zers in the US who've come out of law school or university, and they aren't able to secure employment opportunities. The same thing in the UK. So I think once you start understanding that by virtue of the system producing 400 graduates in whatever schools, and the absorption rate of those graduates into the next level organizations, institutions, it doesn't really match up, right? Because these institutions, as I said, if 400 of us start and only 90 of us can go into the big five, you can already see that the graduation and the absorption, it's quite disproportionate, right? So it's having that clear understanding that that is just the way the system is, and it's always been like that. It's not necessarily that they've made it, changed it just for you because they don't want you in it. No, it is always operated in that manner. And as I say, it's the same thing for when you go into a law firm. There may be 30 or to 50 trainees, candidate attorneys, and those that go to partnership levels from your cohort is probably one or two. So these things are all really there, but the deeper we go into the journey and the more overstimulated we are, the less time that we spend interrogating, analyzing, and understanding. This contributes to our feelings of mental and emotional distress. But we can alleviate our feelings of mental and emotional distress by better understanding those systems and always negotiating our way in them the best way we can. Lastly, I just want to say finding your purpose is key, because I have said in the previous session that what you do is almost inconsequential. How you do it will always matter most. So if you're in law school, it's focusing on what have you learned in law school, not necessarily the law, but skills that are transferable, and that's things like time management. The fact that you were responsible enough to study, to sit for an exam and then show up on that exam, that's teaching you punctuality, right? Even the fact that you registered and saw the degree from start to finish, that's teaching you discipline. So I think it's also about extrapolating. What have you learned in that structure, and how can you apply that in other settings? Because as I say, not everybody is going to make it to a big five law firm or their preferred choice of where they see themselves being. But that doesn't make you less valuable. It doesn't make you less intelligent than anybody. It just means that your path is different. And that's why you have to remain agile and go back to the drawing board, get a piece of paper out and jot down what exactly did you learn in law school that wasn't about the law? And again, any school that wasn't about the law, and how can you best use all of what you've learned and apply that in another setting, and you may surprise yourself. Yeah, I think that with everybody's journey is different. So it's one thing to keep in mind. I never necessarily understood the mentality in law school, law firms about, people thinking if one person is down, it means I'm up. I think it's just a scarcity mindset. I think that everybody has their own unique journey, and understanding the structure that, for me, I've always looked at it as if I'm not, and again, I know that I was going to say that I haven't precursed it by saying this is just, in terms of how I rationalize what's going on in my life. It will always be linked to a higher purpose and a higher power. So I will always look at it and think, if I'm not necessarily making the cut or getting what I think I should be getting, that's only pushing me to go to somewhere else and possibly look at things in a different way. I don't necessarily take that and think, oh, like, cool, I was never supposed to be a lawyer because I didn't make it into law school. Like, no, I think that that's why it's important for you also to have a positive mindset, because I think when your default mindset is positive, you don't necessarily, one, take anything personally, and two, you're always grounded enough, again, as I say, to interrogate the system that you find yourself in, understand what is its outcomes, and then go back to the drawing board and negotiate your way in the world accordingly. So I hope that this has been helpful and shed light to anyone who maybe is feeling like, they're not making it or things aren't necessarily working out. As I say, you have to get to a point where you realize it is what it is. And if your path is not looking like other people's paths, that doesn't make you less valuable, less intelligent, less capable, or less successful. It just means that your path is different. So I do urge you to look at things differently, because when you look at things differently, things actually will also look at you differently and give you a different outcome. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lantern Podcast. I look forward to releasing my next episode. I hope that you're subscribed to the Lantern newsletter, because on the newsletter, I do always include my podcast links from time to time, just so that you can hop on and listen. But if you are new to the podcast, please do subscribe to the platform, Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you enjoy your podcasts. Also, please do subscribe to the Lantern newsletter. On the Lantern newsletter, I do set out a lot of my thought leadership on there as well, because again, I understand people like to read, some people like to watch, some people like to listen. So it's just a matter of trying to get the knowledge to you guys in different forms and different mediums. And of course, please also follow the Seize the Light Foundation page on LinkedIn. And I will also be updating a bit more about Seize the Light Foundation, probably in another podcast. But yes, please do follow along. And also you can follow my LinkedIn as well. It's Khanyi Tshabalala. And yeah, I think, have I given all the follows? I think I'm sorry, I have a lot of platforms now, so I always forget like where I'm all at. But I think those are the important ones. And anyway, when you find me on one of those ones, it will lead you to all the other ones. But please do follow along the work. As I said, we are very invested in building a more compassionate future, and a future that centers around collective wellness as opposed to the individualistic approach that we may have been taking so far. But I think that the evidence, the research, and just where we are and how people are perceiving things, it's kind of telling that something does need to change. But, while we wait for things to change, we can only control ourselves. And in controlling yourself, your breath, your mindset, these are the two things that you can always control. So remember to keep breathing, remember to keep positive, and I will see you on another episode of the Lantern Podcast. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode. Seize the light within yourself with love, the Lantern.